Hi. When we talked, you did a review of a number of projects. So at this point, let's talk a little bit about those projects and some things that you might have seen. So on the left is the way IU12 looks at PBL, and on the right is how the Buck Institute looks at PBL. And we see a lot of correlations between these. So one of the big things is that there has to be a challenging question. You're going to see it in both of them. That it's a period of sustained inquiry. It's a sprint, not just a long period where you're doing a lot of things. It's a sprint to get more information. So we're looking at a longer period. Authenticity is in both, that it's authentic. It's something that they would have to do outside of the classroom, or it could be an outside project, it could be working with others. It's an authentic activity. That there is some form of voice and choice for students in each of these. Students get to make the project, they get to determine the project, they get to go through each of these steps. You'll see public product is in both, and that there is an element that we don't just do the project for ourselves, but we do it for everyone. So this could be working on a science fair. This could be doing a social studies National History Day. This could be putting it out in an article or putting together a book. It's something that's public. So you're going to want to find some way to have them present what they've done so that everyone can work with the learning that they have. That there is some form of critique process is in the right hand. Some on the left you see reflect and revision. We kind of combined critique and revision and reflection on the right hand side, and this is a chance for them to really think about what they're doing. When IU12 looks at it, we look also at significant content. It is important content. In this case, it is standards based, and that there is a key connection. So you take that centerpiece of the PBL version from Buck Institute, and we kind of broke it up into public, in significant content, and 20th century skills, so that it's a little of everything. We look at it that it's specific to the content that you're teaching, and that they also gain the skills. So let's talk a little bit about them. And I've organized these more towards the Buck Institute, but as I said, they kind of correspond. So whenever we look at these, we're looking at essential learning targets or standards. And a standard for this, it may impact a lot of different standards. It may impact content area standards. And we really should impact multiple areas, because in life you don't have this is your math stuff, this is your English stuff, this is your science stuff, this is your history stuff. It doesn't work that way. And we should also look at how we can include physical education, music, religion. How do we bring in all of those areas, especially for CSY? Next, you have some form of problem or project. And in this case, that project or problem has to be at the student's level. There can't be just one answer to a project. So when you're looking at projects, you're not all going to find the same thing. Normally it's a period of debate, or it's a question, or it's a discovery period. So there has to be something that they have to do. Next is this idea of sustained inquiry, that there has to be things that they research. The students come up with questions, the teacher reflects and works with students to come up with questions. These are deep thoughts, these are complex topics. Students need to research, they need to discuss, they may need to prototype, they may need to reflect and prototype again. You can use a lot of design thinking in this, and that it's not a period of here's the question, look in the back of the book, here's the answer. That's not how it works. It's a question of how hard is it going to be, or what can they do, or how can they synthesize the information and support their answers. Resources-wise, you need to think about the resources you have. What are the experts? How can you utilize these resources? In this case, we need to think about who do you have access to? sometimes when we're looking at things, we need to see that we have access to all of these groups of people. In a high school setting, you have people who understand chemistry, biology, social studies, science. They're experts in their field. But on top of that, you have other people that you can work with. If, let's say, you're doing a section on military history and you have a local ROTC or you have a local recruiter, you may bring them in to talk about their military experience as an entry event. You could bring in, if you know famous musicians or you can work with musicians, you could bring in a musician to talk about the history of their work or the history of their field. In this area, there's a lot of colleges. You could talk to professors and see if they would like to team up with you. Sometimes they will, and a lot of this is making sure that that's clear for them. Student choice. Find some way to have students choose. One way is a bingo card, where they have to get one from each letter. So you give them that option that they can choose how they're going to do things. Or you give them the idea that they can create their own project. You set the standards, you set the content, you say, hey, these are what I need you to do. How do you want to show me that you understand it? And this is going to be different for each grade level. A high schooler may be able to come up with a full project and a methodology for getting there, while a kindergartner or a first or second grader may need a bit more prompting and a little bit more clarity in what they have to do. Authenticity. One of the greatest things about authenticity is we need to make sure that people understand what is authentic. Bridge building, for example, could be very authentic. Making a magazine may be authentic to some of them. Having a political discussion about Putin and his role in things may be very specific. You could show them a video like this one.
Pounds of highly dangerous metallic sodium head for destruction in Lake Lenore, Washington. The government surplus chemical ignites and explodes when wet. The alkali lake is devoid of fish and forms an admirable disposal spot. A 3,500-pound container of sodium hurtles into the lake and crashes through a foot of ice. As the water seeps in, smoke rises through a series of muffled explosions.
And you could show them that video, and that would be a very authentic question of what should we do about chemicals? How should we dispose of chemicals? And show them this from the 1940s. Or even building robots like this one. That can be very authentic, especially if you connect it to industry. So there's a lot of different things you can do with authenticity. Reflection should always be part of a PBL unit. How will the students reflect on what they do, and how will you coach them in that reflection? There's a number of different ways on coaching them and working with them, and I think you've done this a lot with feedback and understanding your students. So the question is, how will your students reflect, and how will you coach them through there? Finally, a public product. This extends the learning outside the classroom. One of the big keys, leveraging family and resources. You never know what you're going to find when you talk to people. You may have people in the classroom, you may have former students of the school, you may have different partnerships that the school works with, and that can be the public product for what they're doing. So think about how you can make this a public product and how they can present it. So once we get into this part, we need to think on a couple things too as we build and we plan out these units. So previously you saw the units themselves, and one of the questions I like to think is, where do we go from here? So the image in the upper left is an image of a Robert Frost poem, Stopping by the Woods on a Snowy Evening. And this poem talks about someone going into the woods and trying to figure out what's going on and how beautiful it is. It's a beautiful poem. And people think that it's about death, but when they asked Robert Frost, he just responded with no. He never would explain why he wrote the poem or what the poem's actual meaning was. And that makes the project and the thought process personal to every person. And we need to keep that reflection in mind, especially when we look at design thinking. In the bottom left, you have the ADDIE model, which is a design model, which you'll notice is in a circular nature. The reason it's in a circular nature is because you never stop. You analyze what you have to do, you design it, you come up with how you want it to look, then you build it, you try it out, and then you think about it again. And evaluation really is in each of these pieces. And then you go back to analysis and kind of figure out how you're doing things. If you look in the upper right, that's an engineering design model. And that can be used in pretty much anywhere where you identify what the problem is, you research, you develop, you determine which is the best solution, you prototype, you test it, you communicate, you think about the solution and what you've done, and then you go back through and see if there's other problems that need work. And sometimes you end up going back into research or you go back into development because it might not have been the best solution. So we need to think about that when we do PBL, and especially when we design a PBL, because sometimes when we first create something, it isn't the best it can be. And that's something to give yourself license to do. Give yourself license to fail here. Have the students critique your projects after you're done. Work with them and change the way things work. Also, teach them that it's okay to fail. And then that if they do fail, they need to have the grit to fix it. So it becomes a question of there is an endpoint to the project, but what can we do to make this better? And we work on that constantly. Project creep is another major issue when it comes to PBL. We don't want to make the project too difficult for students. We don't want to make it too easy for students. So we need to think about exactly what the project's going to do. Sometimes projects are awesome and you think this is going to work and it doesn't. Or sometimes you think it'll take 2 weeks and it ends up taking 3 weeks. Or you have a student who doesn't just want to do the article, they want to do a full-fledged video and they want to go through all the steps. And that's kind of project creep, because it's the more that you add, the more it's going to take. And time and amount of work are very, very key here. So keep in mind, are you letting the project creep beyond the standards? And is that creep a positive or a negative? Another thing is backward planning. Backward planning lets us think, what is the end goal? The second we start with what is the end goal, what is the final product that we want, then we can build it as we go. Because once we have the final goal, we can set the steps to go through and think about each of those goals. And if we know the steps that they're going to need, then we can figure out the learning expectations, then we can figure out the learning experiences, we can figure out what we need to teach, what they need to learn, what are the steps that we're going to go through. And it's really starting with the end in mind. So at this point, I'm going to stop talking, and I'd like you to take your standards and look at how the standards will work. If you look down here at the bottom on the site, you're going to see a version of this that you can download and copy, and that will allow you to build this directly in there, or you can use a paper copy if you want to print it. And I want you to think about what works well, as in what, when you look at it, says, I can do a project with this. Activity, the second column, the corollary to PBL work, is there's a series of items. These are standards that may work with PBL, but I'm not sure if they're going to necessarily work. So they may be things I hit on the edge, but they're not specific. Finally, what will not work in PBL? What are the things that students cannot research, that cannot be done? For example, when we're teaching procedural knowledge in how to do order of operations, that really isn't a PBL item. But when we're doing conceptual knowledge, that could be a PBL item. It's corollary. If we're doing a house design unit and you are looking at square foot and you're looking at design, and you bring in some of the building trades and you bring in some of the yard measurements, landscaping, and you're figuring out angles and you're figuring out how you would put a house together, that's really a PBL unit and works really well in a math geometry unit. So it's really a question of how can you get the students to understand these things. So I'd like you to go through this activity. Following this activity, I'd like you to brainstorm, now that you have your standards, what projects can you have students do to fulfill those standards? So once we look at the standards and we think about that, you can use MindMap, you can use a piece of paper, you can use a piece of chart paper. Come up with different projects that you think could fulfill the standards that you're looking to fulfill. And one of the things that you probably should do is then talk to the people in other departments. How do we have cross-curricular items to this? So once we get one or two projects figured out, how can we bring in English and science and math and social studies and related arts and bring them into one larger PBL family and have one project that maybe the students are doing all at one time with all of these different components so that they can see that we don't just do math in math class.